Welcome to Grail Country. My guest today is someone who I've held in high regard for a long time, but I never reached out to talk to before because I really didn't like, even though I held them in high regard, I didn't know what we would talk about. And my guest today is Rafe Kelley of Evolve Move Play. And in his last conversation with Paul Vanderklay, it suddenly struck me that a possible topic that would be interesting to talk about with Rafe would be the theology of play and the childlikeness of God. And so I had Paul share a link to an audio recording of George McDonald's sermon, Child in the Midst, where he reflects upon the part of the gospel where Jesus has a child come to him and talks about that it requires childlikeness to enter the kingdom of God. And so that's kind of like where I thought we would start the conversation today, and then see where it goes from there. And Shari is with me today because Shari is my regular co-host, and Shari is also our resident George McDonald expert and lover of all things McDonald. And she would probably cut me if I didn't include her in a conversation that touched on McDonald at all. So there was no option to leave her out. So yeah, that said, Rafe, did you get a chance to listen to the sermon, and like, what did you think of it?
Yeah, I did get a chance to listen to at least most of it. It's interesting. There's a kind of mode of talking that is common in sort of pastoral circles that I'm still pretty unused to, right? It's hard for me to it's hard for me as someone kind of raised in the, intellectually in the evolutionary biology, scientific materialism worldview, to kind of navigate the specific language and the ways of justifying claims.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't help too that McDonald is also, mid to late 19th century writer.
Yeah.
So there's also, 19th century language too. So that doesn't help sometimes. So let me ask you this. Let's back up. Let's back up because I want to respect the fact that you're not a believer.
Okay.
So
I don't know what that means.
I think
I don't either.
Yeah. And let me see if I can approach it this way. Trying to figure out a way to put this. If there were a God, let's put it, let's couch it in conditional terms, right? So rather than presuming that there is a God, if there were a God, what would God be like?
Yeah.
And we can kind of like frame the conversation in that way, rather than
Sure.
presuming that there is a God.
I kind of I don't know. I start to feel like Jordan Peterson here, where I'm a little like, well, what do you mean by God?
My God, yeah. Let me interject here quickly, because when I was reading this, I was thinking about you, Rafe. I was thinking, I haven't actually listened to a lot of your conversations. Unfortunately, I've heard a few, but I'm aware of what you do, and I think, for me anyway, watching you, your parkour video, for example, that tells me everything about you, actually, more than what you could say. And when I was rereading the sermon by George McDonald, and I think that's key. It's a sermon by George McDonald. So George McDonald writes fantasy. He's actually considered the grandfather of fantasy literature. And so this is not really his style. Like, this is not really who he is. He's talking to a certain group of people, and mostly people he doesn't agree with. Okay. So keep that in mind. But when I was reading it, I was thinking, why don't we just throw flow in there instead of God? And I think if we were to understand it as flow, childlikeness as flow, I think that would be a better, what do you call that? Like entrance into the sermon itself, right? Because there's an idea in there of presence and presencing, and things presencing themselves, right? Like you being present and things presencing themselves. And then there's also the idea of eternity, right? Like, I don't know how you want to, like, this is another Jordan Peterson thing. Like, what do you mean by eternity? Is that forever? Or, like, what, is it in time? Is it without time? Is it timeless? But anyway, let's just keep it simple and say eternity. So anyway, that's I don't know if that's helpful.
I'm not sure what to pick up on. What I guess what I noticed in listening to that was, one, it was like, okay, this is interesting just from the sense of how systems of justification, that's a word that comes to mind, right? I don't know if you guys follow Greg Enrique's work, right? He talks about systems of justification. So when I listen to Jordan Peterson or even Jonathan Pageau, right, I can recognize a system of justification, like a logical system they're using to verify a claim. So Pageau, his logic is clear in many ways, but how he's sort of deriving some of his base priors can be very difficult for me to navigate, right? Because it's a sort of intuitive, I think the closest thing from a scientific perspective is kind of like a multi-factor, multi-model verification, right? So, you can talk about a universal pattern if you see it in Hinduism and you see it in Christianity and you see it in Taoism and you see it in different strains of Christianity. And so like the meeting of heaven and earth. So that kind of justification, it makes sense to me. When you, like, a lot of Christian sort of argumentation or theology is kind of rooted in this biblical justification, right? So when I was listening to George McDonald, he's sort of making an argument about how we should interpret this specific thing, and he's contextualizing it through other claims that are rooted in justification, specifically within the biblical corpus. And that's why it's really difficult for me to really know how to get my kind of hands on what's actually happening there. Because one, I'm not that familiar with the biblical corpus, right? I'm not actually used to sort of swimming in those waters.
So I think the reason McDonald is, I think it comes back to the point that Shari was making, is who's McDonald's audience. So McDonald was a Presbyterian minister. Okay. He is raised in the hyper Calvin. He comes up out of the hyper Calvinist Scottish Presbyterian tradition, and he is the opposite of everything that is theologically. He's a universalist.
Okay.
So he is challenging a vision of God that is held by other Christians. And so and in order to make that argument to other Christians, he's appealing to the scriptures for that reason. I think that you okay, here's what I'm going to say. I think that from the things that I've heard you say, I don't want to, please don't take offense at this, because I'm not trying to put words in your mouth or anything like that, but I would say that you are already reflecting a vision of God in what you do. And I would also say this, that what you do is in many ways very much a ministry that is consistent with McDonald's vision of God.
Okay. I mean, I'm not offended by that.
Okay.
Like
can I interject again?
Sure.
Because I think that the reason that this is stalling a little bit is because of the theological nature of the sermon. Okay. So I want to show you how George takes that theology and he puts it into his fiction.
Okay.
So I'm going to read you a portion of a story called The Golden Key.
Okay.
And it's a little bit long, but I think it's really worth listening to, especially if you've already read the sermon. So it's about a girl who is on a journey, and she has to go. She meets the old man of the sea, the old man of the earth, and each one of them takes her a little further down into the center of the earth, right? Shows her a way through, and she has to go through. And her final destination is the old man of the fire. Okay.
Okay.
So this is her arriving. At the long last, the stair ended at a rude archway in all but glowing rock. Through this archway, Tangle fell exhausted in a cool, mossy cave. The floor and walls were covered with moss, green, soft, and damp. A little stream spouted from a rent in the rock and fell into a basin of moss. She plunged her face into it and drank. Then she lifted her head and looked around. Then she rose and looked again. She saw no one in the cave. But the moment she stood upright, she had a marvelous sense that she was in the secret of the earth and all its ways. Everything she had seen or learned from books, all that her grandmother had said or sung to her, all the talk of the birds, beasts, and fishes, all that had happened to her on her journey with Mossy, and since then in the heart of the earth with the old man and the older man, all was plain. She understood it all and saw that everything meant the same thing, though she could not have put it into words again. The next moment, she cried out, in a corner of the cave, a little naked child sitting on the moss. He was playing with balls of various colors and sizes, which he disposed in strange figures upon the floor beside him. And now Tangle felt that there was something in her knowledge which was not in her understanding. For she knew there must be an infinite meaning in the change and sequence and individual forms of the figures into which the child arranged the balls, as well as in the varied harmonies of their color. But what it all meant, she could not tell. He went on busily, tirelessly, playing his solitary game without looking up, or seeming to know that there was a stranger in his deep, withdrawn cell. Diligently, as a lace maker shifts her bobbins, he shifted and arranged his balls. Flashes of meaning would now pass from them to Tangle. And now again, all would not be merely obscure, but utterly dark. She stood looking for a long time, for there was fascination in the sight. And the longer she looked, the more an indescribable vague intelligence went on rousing itself in her mind. For 7 years, she had stood there watching the naked child with his colored balls, and it seemed to her like 7 hours. When all at once the shape the balls took, she knew not why, reminded her of the Valley of Shadows, and she spoke. "Where's the old man of the fire?" she said. "Here I am," answered the child, rising and leaving his balls on the moss. "What can I do for you?" There was such an awfulness of absolute repose on the face of the child that Tangle stood dumb before him. She had no smile, but the love in his large gray eyes was as deep as the center. And with the repose there lay on his face a shimmer as of moonlight, which seemed as if any moment it might break into such a ravishing smile as would cause the beholder to weep himself to death. But the smile never came, and the moonlight lay there unbroken, for the heart of the child was too deep for any smile to reach from it to his face. "Are you the oldest man of all?" Tangle at length, although filled with awe, ventured to ask. "Yes, I am. I am very, very old. I am able to help you, I know. I can help everybody." And the child drew near and looked up in her face so that she burst into tears. "Can you tell me the way to the country the shadows fall from?" she sobbed. "Yes, I know the way quite well. I go there myself sometimes, but you could not go my way. You're not old enough. I will show you how you can go." "Do not send me out into the great heat again," prayed Tangle. "I will not." And he reached up and put his little cool hand on her heart. "Now," he said, "you can go. The fire will not burn you. Come." He led her from the cave, and following him through another archway, she found herself in a vast desert sand of rock. The sky of it was of rock, lowering over them like solid thunderclouds, and the whole place was so hot that she saw in bright rivulets the yellow gold and white silver and red copper trickling molten from the rocks, but the heat never came near her. When they had gone some distance, the child turned up a great stone and took something like an egg from under it. He next drew a long curved line in the sand with his finger and laid the egg in it. He then spoke something Tangle could not understand. The egg broke, a small snake came out, and lying in the sand, in the line in the sand, grew and grew till he filled it. The moment he was full grown, he began to glide away, undulating like a sea wave. Follow that serpent, said the child. He will lead you the right way. Tangle followed the serpent, but she could not go far without looking back at the marvelous child. He stood alone in the midst of the glowing desert, beside a fountain of red flame that had burst forth at his feet, his naked whiteness glimmering a pale rosy red in the torrid fire. There he stood, looking after her till, from the lengthening distance, she could see him no more. The serpent went straight on, turning neither to the right nor the left. So there's the real George. I just had to share you that.
Yeah, that's easier for me. It's interesting because I know that George MacDonald was kind of the predecessor of Tolkien and Lewis. Tolkien gets the credit as the sort of founder of fantasy because the way that he wrote had such influence on what came later and created such an efflorescence of sort of fantasy literature. But it has been pointed out to me that he's not actually the first person to sort of try to bring the writing of new fairy tales forward. He had antecedents, right? George MacDonald is one of them. But I haven't actually gone back and read MacDonald. But it is quite interesting to hear it and think about how in MacDonald, as well as in Tolkien and Lewis, that genre is in many ways serving as a way of exploring a Christian imagination. And, maybe trying to solve Nietzsche's death of God in this arena. R. Scott Baker is one of my favorite.
Yeah, and I think
sorry, I said
sorry.
R. Scott
I
Baker.
might have a bit of a
Okay. R. Scott Baker is one of my favorite fantasy authors, but quite a difficult and dark vision. He says that if God is dead, then fantasy is his graveyard, and we like to visit because it's where because we still miss living in a world with meaning. And so it's quite interesting to me that fantasy fiction essentially starts with, I think, some quite sophisticated people theologically, and then it's picked up and popularized by people who largely are secular and reject, or in many ways are sort of, they love the genre and they love the feeling that they got from Tolkien, but they're actually entirely antagonistic to the worldview that gave rise to it. Like Dune, I think is it's a really interesting counterpoint to Tolkien as very skeptical and postmodern work in its way, right? Not postmodern in rejecting all narratives or right, making bad fiction, but postmodern in the sense of a deep skepticism of overarching narratives, right? Here's the promised king, and what he brings is actually tyranny. So I'm quite fascinated by that, and I find that I don't, I've read fantasy fiction and science fiction for most of my life, and I find myself pretty jaded with the whole genre because of the lack of real belief in meaning, right? Or the people are playing with the form while actually rejecting the underlying structures. And I think that ultimately that ends up being pretty, you can only invert so far, and then there's just nothing.
I don't know if that if the modern skepticism about overarching narratives actually is at all damaging to Christianity, though. For the German theologian Jürgen Moltmann, he also wrote a book on the theology of play, And Moltmann is like, in his book, he's like, that's, he actually points out how political ideologies of both the right and the left end up becoming about like absolutizing their own moral frameworks.
Mhm.
And play is the remedy that he recommends for that. And he also says that religious reformations can do that religious reformations can also do the same thing that political ideologies do, because they become too much about absolutizing essentially their agenda.
Yeah.
So play doesn't have an agenda.
Yeah. Autotelic.
Right, exactly.
Have you watched Peugeot's talk from ARC? Jonathan
Mhm.
Peugeot.
I have not yet.
It's very
I
good.
have. Yeah.
I think it's an extraordinarily strong presentation in trying to create a bridge between a sort of secular worldview and a religious worldview or symbolic worldview.
Mhm.
And at the end, he talked. One of the core themes is the idea of the tyranny of lower order goods.
Yeah.
That when we reject what is sort of when we can't conceptualize what is highest well, then we'll put something else in its place.
Mhm.
And the thing that we put in its place will end up becoming tyrannical. And so I think that's very much in alignment with what you just said, which is that when we don't have an idea of the transcendent good, then we can kind of create these lower order goods of, right wingness or left wingness or veganness or, environmental apocalypse or CrossFit
Right.
or
And I
whatever
think
it is.
all of these kinds of views, they have an under not it's not always clearly stated, and but they have an underlying assumption of what the world is for.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so go ahead, Sherry.
I mean, the thing that comes to my mind when Rafe was talking about that was that Jesus put it in these terms. He said, if you save your life, you will lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake, you will save it. For
Yeah.
my sake, for Christ consciousness, let's say.
Yeah.
And so, and this is what happens when we fall into the tyranny of those lower order desires, right? Safety. And I mean, Jonathan used COVID as an example, and I thought it was a really great example. Because and I think that directly translates onto the idea of play, right? Because when you're playing, you're not saving your life, right? You're risking it, actually.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you're losing your life for Christ consciousness, which is the childlike curiosity, which drives you to seek and to find, right? I just think about myself as a kid when I was building forts. Like it wasn't really about some kind of a system of play. Like, we didn't have in mind first we do this and that and that, and it wasn't like life is, where you get up and you go to work and you come home and you have lunch, and it was mostly about building the fort. Once the fort was done, everybody kind of decided to go home. you know the play was in the discovery of the thing that you hadn't known yet.
Yeah. So what's occurring to me is this idea of, well, what Jonathan says at the end of that talk is the highest good is incomprehensible, right? It's ineffable. It's beyond our ability to fully contain. And that when we remember that, it humbles us properly. Which is interesting because I think you find the same insight in Taoism, right? In the beginning of
Yeah.
Tao Te Ching, it says the way that can be named is not the eternal way.
Yeah.
And then it says the nameless is the mother of all things, and the name gives rise to the 10,000 things. So what I always like that passage because it contains two things. One, it says, right, what we can know is always insufficient. What we can name is always insufficient, and yet we still have to name things, right? Like we bring order into a world that is always bounded by the things that are outside of our capacity to order and to comprehend. And from like Peterson might say that play is a sort of dancing on the border between order and chaos.
Yeah.
Right. What makes a good game is actually that it contains both well, right? More Petersonian language. It's kind of a good game is a walled garden. It's a paradise. Because if you have total freedom, right, unbounded potential, you don't actually have a game. You have chaos. You have anarchy. And that's actually that's not like people think that that's what children's play is like, but it's not.
No. It's interesting because if you watch children play, these little fights break out because somebody crosses the boundary, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, no, you're not allowed to do that. And it's so funny because it's usually never spoken. It's not written down. Nobody signs a contract, right? They're just playing, and all of a sudden somebody broke the rules.
Yeah. And the rules are often different in different children's heads. But
totally, yeah.
But also different people sort of have a more ordered or more chaotic style of play. So I'm probably, temperamentally, I'm probably a fairly liberal person, at least by the old metrics, even though I moved on into the other camp at this stage or try to transcend the camps. But I'm very high in openness, right? From a temperamental standpoint. And I like things to be novel, and I don't require a lot of structure, right? I can sort of get myself off the ground and doing stuff with very little structure. My son is very conscientious, has been from a very early age. So I have ADHD. When my son was 2 years old, my mom told me, "Your son doesn't have ADHD." And I said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because he closes the door every time he leaves a room." So this would create a little bit of like a parent-child conflict between me and my son, because he loves to roughhouse with me, and I'll invent a game and we'll play this game, and then I will change the game, but he'll get mad at me, especially when he was little, when he was 2, 3, 4 years old. Like if I changed the rules of the game, he would get upset and he would tell me like, "No, I want to play it exactly the same as last time," right? Like, so a classic game we would play is like, this is my couch, where I'm sitting on the couch and he tries to get on the couch and I have to push him off. But if I like broke out into some other kind of wrestling or tickling or something, he'd get really, really frustrated with me, right? Because I had transgressed the rules of the game. He understood the rules. He wanted to play within the rules. And he's like that throughout his life. He likes to understand what the rules of any given situation are, and then he's very, very oriented towards excellence. It's like as long as he can clearly understand the rules, he's going to excel. Whereas I, as a kid, didn't care what other people's game was. I was going to play my own game.
Well, I'm in the 99th percentile for openness, and I'm in the 99th percentile for conscientiousness.
Oh, interesting.
So just imagine what that's like. It's like, leave the door open, no, close it. You're having these conversations all the time, right?
Yeah.
And when you talked about excellence and novelty, those things are really hard to reconcile when you have both things going on in your head. Okay. So one of the things that I noticed about my life was I just did everything, and I could do everything. Like if I wanted to know something and learn something, a language, or I could just do it. Yeah. But then I would have this feeling like I failed because it wasn't excellent. Right. I didn't master it. So it was I was in the world of jack of all trades and master of none. And it wasn't until later in my life, which is like now, that I decided when I started a new project, I got sheep and I started to spin and processed fiber, and and because of my desire for novelty, I can't just buy it. I have to raise the animal. Okay.
Yeah.
Because I want to watch the whole thing. I want to watch it grow, right? And then
You should probably tell them that you are a farmer, so that doesn't quite seem as random as it sounded.
yeah, I have a
Okay.
farm.
Okay.
And but I never had sheep before. I had goats for 25 years. But anyway, so I get these animals, and then I learn the whole thing, and I'm really quite good at it, without sounding too arrogant. And then I'm like starting to get bored
Yeah.
by it. And I'm like, wait a minute.
Exactly. I think it's the curse of the super high in openness. Like I have a history of being sort of at the forefront of various waves and leaving them right before they become a successful niche.
Before they crash to the shore.
Yeah, me too.
So I was a early adopter of CrossFit, left
Yeah.
that before it became really successful. I was an early adopter of the paleo diet, barefoot running, something called MoveNat, parkour, right at the kind of peak of all these things, or right before they peaked. I'm just like, I've lost interest in moving on to my own new pastures. So yeah, I'm always sort of running ahead of the wave and then jumping before the wave can crest.
But what I wanted to say was what I decided. I
Mhm.
got a really strong nudge to no, it's time to master.
Yeah.
Okay, Little Miss Jack of all trades. It's time to master now. And so I had to reapply myself to everything. I had to approach my spinning wheel with a completely different, like, I didn't realize how different the perspective on the wheel was right now suddenly, or the perspective on the caring, the husbandry of the flock, or the perspective, all this stuff, right? And getting back to the sermon and the idea of play and the childlikeness of God, there is a single-mindedness that George MacDonald talks about in that sermon, right? That God is just singular in his devotion, and that lends itself, like, we think of childishness as kind of flitting around, right, from place to place.
So where my mind actually goes with it, Shari, is actually Tomberg's the first of the meditations on the tarot, the magician.
Yeah, exactly. That's where
because what Tomberg says there is that it essentially the core of mysticism is concentration without effort that turns work into
play. That's right. And so this is where I was going. I was going to talk about the magician, because when you push yourself to that point where you think, okay, now it's time to master. Now it's work. It's no longer novelty, right? Now it's the grindstone, and you have to get just past that, and then it becomes play again. It becomes novel. It's just so interesting.
I wrote an essay many years ago about this idea that a practice should be always sort of balancing between a widening and a deepening. And the widening is going out and trying new things, right? And the deepening is trying to find the new within the old, trying to take it to the next level. And so I've practiced many movement arts, right? But over the last 18 years, I have consistently done parkour basically at least 2 or 3 times a week, every week for 18 years. So I'll do 6 months of contemporary dance, 6 months of capoeira, 6 months of hand balancing, whatever it is. But I just keep coming back to parkour, and to a lesser degree, I keep coming back to mixed martial arts. But those for me are like the windows into mastery. And then I keep myself fresh. I keep myself sort of absorbing new insights, being able to see differently, being able to view my primary sports with a different lens, because I'm going out and experiencing these other things. And so I think this is a really key understanding, is that we, in a pathway of self-cultivation, you need this novelty, and you
Yeah.
need those consistent pillars,
Yeah.
something you can scaffold your development off of.
I'm
So-
just, I just want to ask you, like, so with the parkour, I can imagine that because it's done in a natural setting, or even in a city setting, I guess. I don't know if you do it in the cities. Do you do it?
Not too much, a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. I can see why, actually, because it's about unpredictableness, right? Shape, unpredictable shape, don't you think? Like,
Partially.
so that in the forest, for example, unless you're repeating, you know, a path or a thing that you do all the time, if you're moving in different areas, you're going to be encountering novel shapes, and those shapes are going to have to be overcome in different ways, right?
Yeah, I mean,
And
there's different ways to do that, right? There's different, like, parkour athletes sort of find and seek complexity
yeah,
across different dimensions. So some athletes, for instance, are just progressing acrobatic movements, and they like relatively simple environments because it allows them to kind of go and practice the same fundamental movements, but just make them a little bit more complex.
yeah,
Other athletes look for very unique situations that allow totally unique movements within urban environments. And then for me, like, I like moving in nature in part because of what you're saying, right? Because it is the adaptive sort of demand of the natural environment is higher.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Each element is more inherently complex generally. But I also like being in nature just because I like being in nature.
Yeah.
Right. Like I like being in nature because I like sun, and I like sweet breezes that have been, you know, brushed with the phytochemicals of trees and water and ions. And I if I need a lot of time in the natural world in my life.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if I practice parkour in the natural world, then I just get to stack those things. And so there's such an inherent attraction to me in being around trees or being around waterfalls that's where I want to practice.
You are also in the Pacific Northwest too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Shari and I are also. She's in British Columbia. I'm in Washington. So
Yeah.
But I'm not I'm in a semi-arid area. I'm in the interior
yeah,
of British Columbia, so it's
yeah.
not green and mossy. And
No, yours.
you know,
You live
I mean,
in the part that looks like Eastern Washington. Looks like that too.
we don't have, we do have moss, but yeah, it's just different. Yeah.
Although I can see the trees behind you.
Yeah.
Look like, are those a pine? Ponderosa pine?
Those are fir.
Okay,
We have a lot of Douglas fir.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
A lot of that here too. Going back to the that passage you read, so you have an image of God, and in that image of God, you see a child at play, and he's in it. The child is doing a very specific kind of play, which is a object-oriented play. So within play research, we talk about, or researchers talk about, a locomotor play. So running, jumping, climbing. That's the roots of parkour. Object-oriented play, which is picking things up, moving them, manipulating them, arranging them into shapes, doing all sorts of interesting things with them, building forts, right? And then interactive play, rough and tumble play. And then sort of beyond the physical, then you can talk about narrative play, pretend play, etc. But just kind of physical things that we do, in that most animals engage in both locomotor play and rough and tumble play. Not that many other animals engage in object-oriented play, but like bears do. Bears love to play with sticks, and so do monkeys and things like that. Ravens are super interested in bright, shiny objects and feathers and interesting stuff. So you have these three fundamental forms of play. Now, you have God as represented as the child, who's completely absorbed in the arrangement of these shapes and these balls, right? The ball is kind of one of the universal form. There's kind of three things that you see always, which is like my friend calls it the rock, the rod, and the rope, right? These are three universal toys. And we could probably say the doll too, right? which is, can just be a rock or
The
a rope.
human,
Yeah.
the human shape.
Yeah. And that's, that's a thing that children will just get fascinated by. Give them some bright, shiny things and they'll rearrange them in shapes over and over and over again. And there's a way in which that's a beautiful metaphor for a creator.
Mm-hmm.
What actually struck me about that is how it reminds me of my father.
Mm.
So I don't know if you guys have run into who my dad was.
Yes, I have. Actually, before I knew about you, I was watching his videos.
There you go. Yeah.
He
So for the
speaks my
audience,
language.
yeah, for the audience, my father was son Rafe Kelley, who is a world famous natural builder. And so I grew up on 12 acres in the woods that my dad had inherited. And he spent his whole life basically rearranging that land, building structures, making new things all the time. So that was his joy. That was his play. Just like I'm like sort of a locomotor play guy and a interaction play guy. My dad was that too, but really what he loved was to make things, to make beautiful things. And it was absolutely play for him, right? It was he was lost in it and absorbed by it, and he couldn't stop doing it. I was always sort of like, leave the land alone. I like the land how it is. Like, why do you need to put another structure up, right? But later I just realized that like he's like a kid in a sandbox. He can't stop building any more than I can stop running and jumping and climbing, right? It was just who he was. And a tremendous amount of beautiful things came out of that.
Yeah.
And it was driven by something that was deeply deeply childlike, right? It was and that the capacity that my dad had to enter this play space and allow this creativity to pour out of him.
Yeah. There's an interesting part too about that in there about the harmonies. I just want to see if I can find it here.
While you look, do you mind if I make a quick observation?
Yeah.
One of the things about this notion of the childlikeness of God is that it does when you start to contemplate on the meaning of this idea of the childlikeness of God, it very much points away from God as this intellectual abstraction. And it's also important to note that McDonald says in the sermon, he says that Christ became flesh, but he did not become a man because he was man already.
Yeah.
So he's very much like he's pointing toward the part of us that is always already divine and making that gesture that participates in Christ's humanity. So, and this is another bridge that I think I could offer to to a secular person, is that whatever else God is, God also has a human face. And a lot of times what secular people are objecting to is actually this notion of God as an intellectual abstraction, which I personally have very little interest in.
Yeah.
Okay, I would say I would think that it's actually the opposite. It's the human, it's the demand to see the God as the sky daddy that is the hardest for secular people.
Right. I agree. Yeah. I agree.
So for me, right. Like when you ask me if I'm a believer, or when you say that, I think that in many ways I'm closer to sort of a classical theological position than I am to an atheist.
Right.
But I'm also very, very far from sort of evangelical sky daddy interpretation of God. But
well, so is George. That's why. That's precisely why he writes the sermon, right? Because that idea of the kingly God on his throne, hurling thunderbolts and being all about it as glory is precisely what McDonald's is saying no to. That's why he's pointing toward this childlikeness of God as a counterpoint to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
What?
The Sky Daddy, I think the Sky Daddy was the prominent, he talks about, in other sermons, he talks about people thinking that, God is like Zeus shooting down thunderbolts when they do something wrong, right? Like, so he's really trying to smash that image. And so he takes, and what's interesting is in his unspoken sermons, they're written in a certain order.
Yeah.
And I watched a lecture on it one time, and they have a chiastic structure too. So so they move in and then out. So they take you right to a place. And the very first one is the child in the midst. It's the first sermon in the series.
Just as the very first, the first of Tom Burke's Meditations on the Tarot
is the magician.
The first arcanum is the magician, which is the arcanum that teaches you the concentration without effort that turns work into play. So he's pointing you in exactly the same direction. They're like, this is how you connect to the ground.
They both point to childlikeness.
Right. That is where the ground is to be found, is in that place. When you connect to that. When you use the term flow state, like that's very much what happens. Like when you are in a flow state, you are very much, regardless of what you intellectually think about it, you're in an experience of being connected to that place.
Well, that's why Tango is there for 7 years, but it feels like 7 hours.
Yeah,
right.
Right.
He does that a lot. Yeah.
Because in a play or a flow state, you experience time. It's sort of time distortion is the best way to describe it, because it feels both longer and shorter.
Yeah.
Because essentially the demands on your perceptual and motor systems, on the kind of the effort that you're outputting, grow so high that your brain shuts down the part of you that tracks time effectively. That's our neurological understanding of it. Flow states are associated with hypofrontality, which is the frontal cortex, the part of us that's self-conscious, that thinks a lot, is actually inhibited during sort of the neural activity is decreased, because of the perceptual and motor control systems, whatever's outputting the creative output that we're doing, ends up sort of ramping up to such a degree that it demands all of the attention. One of the most intense flow state experiences I've had was last summer, not this previous one, not the one that we just had, but the previous one. I went canyoneering. Have you guys ever heard of canyoneering?
Heard of it.
Okay, so canyoneering is when you drop down into a canyon with a series of waterfalls, and then you rappel down the waterfalls and hike down the canyon, or in my case, do parkour down the canyon, right?
Bounce off the canyon.
Yeah. So I have this particular canyon here that I absolutely just love. There's a series of water slides and big drops and jumps that I can do into the water between rocks. And I took some friends out there, and we dropped into the canyon, and I realized that I'd left the rope at the car. So it was like a 35-minute hike down through bushwhacking to get to the canyon, and I now had to go uphill to go get this thing. So I raced up there as fast as I could, because they're stuck just waiting for me in the canyon until I get back with the rope. And so I was quite fatigued by the time I got back to the car, and then I turn around and go back, and I start just racing down the slope, like basically running. And I'm grabbing these trees and using them to swing myself safely down these slopes, and then sliding a lot, just like letting myself slide down the hill. And I just basically almost completely became unconscious, right? I can remember the experience, I can remember the flow of the information, but my narrative mind was just gone. It was completely gone. It was
right. That narrative, I'm glad you put that narrative mind, because that's like that character that you're playing in your head all the time. Like that's what, the ego goes on holiday.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's this interesting way in which we through movement, through play, we can access this this experiencing of self unfolding, that effortless effort. I think you were alluding to,
concentration without effort. Yeah.
what the Japanese call mushin no shin, mind of no mind.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
what the Taoists call wu wei, you know, effortless effort. John Vervaeke introduced me to the idea of inkratia and sophrosine. Inkratia being willpower that is effortful, and sophrosine being willpower that is effortless. So you can imagine two, you know, young men meet a beautiful woman, but they're already in a marriage, right? Both of them can see that the woman is beautiful, that there's potential for a relationship with her, and that it would be really rewarding for them in some sense to do it. And one man wrenches his attention away from her, feels pain and temptation and desire, and it's, you know, really difficult. But he does it, right? And he goes back to his wife. And the other man recognizes all the same things, but they simply don't have any hold on him. There's no temptation.
There's a part of the sermon where McDonald says this very interesting thing that I think connects what you were just saying, where he points out that when under the umbrella of love, obedience and will become the same. That that there's actually they're not in conflict.
Yeah. So that triggers a whole bunch of things for me around the libertarian ethic of secular humanism and how it fundamentally is failing people. And how this rubric of love is the highest gives us something that succeeds much better. But
yeah, so that we worship the same thing, we just put different labels on it.
Yeah, that's true.
No, seriously, like they're actually, I have like, there's actually another like TLC figure who actually like calls our entire Grail Country channel the Love Idolaters.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I encountered Peterson, and Peterson described the concept of logos, right? And he gave me a sort of scientific language and philosophical, psychological language around logos, and that became very, very important to me. And then through John, I encountered agape, right? And yeah, his episode on agape like changed my whole life.
And you can, and clearly the way, I think the way John in particular talks about agape, you can see how play is a part of that agape, right? Because it is like play is involved in the person making process, like deeply involved. It forms us, it shapes us.
I think that it's agape is not coercive, right? And that's how play feels. It you know, when you're immersed in play, even with another, and both faces are usually smiling, right? There's no coercion happening. There's no you know, fitting a square peg into a round hole feeling going on, right? It's loving one another into being,
right? Even if there's competition, it still has those characteristics.
So there's so agape is the love that exists to bring good into being, right? So we love the child not because we seek to become one with the child, and we love the child not because we expect fair reciprocation of that love. We love the child because we have a responsibility to love the child, and through the love of that child, we contribute to its coming into being, through its expression of its full potential for being. In some sense, play is a kind of principle of that, because
that's right.
We play because we love to play. And play unfolds us into our own being without any preconditions or expectations, in some sense.
You know what's interesting is
go ahead, Sherry. No, I was just going to say, and like the best parents are those who never lost that sensibility and that joy, and are able to play and play well with their children. And like, you can't be a good parent. You really can't be a good parent if you can't do that. You really, I mean, it's actually impossible. That is absolutely critical.
There's a couple things that come to my mind. They're totally, I mean, they're sort of related, but not. One of them is George McDonald's focus in all of his writings is to reveal God as Father, right? And so you're talking about how you perceive your own children as a father. And that is the only way to understand agape, right? So what George McDonald always is talking about is agape, because he's talking about God as a father. He's trying to show mostly Christians that God is Father, right? And then the other thing that came to my mind when you were talking was I spent a lot of time training horses. And one of the things that is on the top of a horse's list of priorities is play. It's almost more important than food for a horse.
I just want to point out that the childlikeness, he's actually talking about the childlikeness to get you in order to see, for you to see God as Father in the right way, to see God as Father as the Father who has not lost their own sense of childlikeness within themselves and wants to engage in play with you to help to form you, as opposed to this authoritarian figure who's just there to lay down the law. And that's all there is to it. So he's pointing to a particular kind of image of God of God as Father, in pointing toward this childlikeness as a gateway to that. So God is the Father. Well, like McDonald himself, like who was like, like McDonald was like a father and grandfather, and like there are lots and lots of pictures of McDonald surrounded by children. And he's someone who loved children and loved to interact with children, and very much like reflected in its own life what he's talking about.
There's a favorite quote in the sermon for me. It says, "For when is the child the ideal child in our eyes and to our hearts? Is it not when, with gentle hand, he takes his father by the beard and turns that father's face up to his brothers and sisters to kiss? When even the lovely selfishness of love-seeking has vanished and the heart is absorbed in loving? In this, then, is God like the child, that he is simply and altogether," and then he goes on to describe that. But he, again, and further down, he says, "With him, all is simplicity of purpose and meaning and effort and end. Namely, that we should be as he is, think the same thoughts, mean the same things, possess the same blessedness." Yeah. I love that even the lovely selfishness of love seeking has vanished.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's always touching when your children show that, right? When they show that attention to the needs of their siblings, children in the environment, and, really capacity for empathy is beautiful.
It's like Nate mentioned this already with Tomberg and the magician. The magician, the symbol of the card is that magician is holding a stick and a ball, but he holds it at his fingertips. And the meaning in that is that he holds them lightly, like he has complete mastery over them, but he has that mastery.
His hat has the shape of the infinity symbol too, so it shows like it's like it shows what he's connecting to. In that place of concentration without effort, like that's you're connecting to that infinite source of all things.
But what I wanted to ask you, Rafe, is how, I don't know if you think about this at all, but how connected do you see play to mysticism, or do you even see that? Because there's a thing that happens in play, and I'm sure you can relate to this. It's insight.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Again, I guess clarification of terms is interesting here, but I was definitely like, traumatized by the kind of wishy-washy woo of the counterculture growing up, right? Like
Yeah.
my first, I know like Vervaeke's a big fan of the Rhineland mystics, and there's kind of powerful veins of mysticism that tap into important things. And I've been studying kind of sorry, just one second.
No problem.
I've been studying how play is related to ritual, right? And yeah, I mean, there's actually, pretty profound bridges that we can talk about, and I think epistemologically sound ways between this, right? Through play, a group can kind of become a hyper object or hyper agent more effectively, right? And through ritual, we can do that even more powerfully. So one of the things that we do at our retreats is we have rituals, and those rituals we have kind of gained them over time or they've grown over time because we recognize how they help catalyze a group identity, and that group identity becomes a support structure for the individuals that allows them to psychologically overcome themselves in ways that they can't when they're trapped in their individual consciousness. So that is in some sense a mystical thing, right? My way of conceptualizing that is very psychological and very scientific.
Yeah, well, I just want to interject here that it is for Tomberg too. Mysticism is not woo. It's actually a series of steps that evolve consciousness, and religious people have used other terms to describe the same thing. For example, repentance. Repentance is in the Greek metanoia, and metanoia means a turning, right? So it's an aha moment. You can't repent, you can't classically repent if you don't see something new.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it is in and of itself an evolution of consciousness. So and so I think that mysticism, if you want to put it in more accessible terms, is and I think most people get it mixed up because it has so much baggage, but it's a form of contemplation that leads to metanoia, right?
Well, to the experience of God. Like that's essentially like mysticism proper is the encounter with God through the experience of God. So you're not connecting to God. You're not making a rational philosophical argument about God. You're not you're through whatever set of practices, you are coming into direct contact and you're experiencing God.
So
Here's the thing, and I understand your reaction against like that kind of like new age like counterculture stuff.
Yeah.
And one of the problem with it is that what it does is human beings can ruin anything, right? We really can. And what happens with that kind is that those kinds of movements, they take that to say, I'm better and more spiritually advanced than you. And they turn it into a power game. And then they look down on other people. But that doesn't have anything. That's actually, all of that behavior is actually entirely contrary to the true spirit of mysticism, which is to engage in practices to bring yourself into contact with the divine.
So yeah, I agree. I would just add that I think that one of the problems of different strains of mysticism is that they're very powerful systems for generating bullshit, right? And they're Harry Frankfurt, sense of bullshit as like shifting our salience landscape so that the truth value of a statement is no longer meaningful to us, right? So this is, I think, where I end up, very attached to scientific epistemology is
Mhm.
because it's good at ruling out bullshit. And when I listen to someone like Pajot, any kind of religious thinkers, that's always the question I have is like, okay, there's something of value that you're articulating here, but I don't know how exactly you hold the difference between this and a lot of the bullshit, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for me, what I'm really interested in is this kind of how we build that bridge, right? How do we kind of have I was talking to John Vervaeke recently about this idea that like a bottoms up emergent scientific paradigm is very good at giving us rule out.
Well, essentially, it's indistinguishable from doubt. Like, essentially, that is like the scientific method. Essentially, is at its core, it is doubt. Like that's what it is. That's what drives it. It is driven entirely by doubt, and
Doubt.
driven by doubt. Now, doubt put to productive use.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's still like at its core, it is doubt.
Yeah.
So that means that it can't. It actually, because of the nature of what the method is founded on, there are certain things it can't possibly have anything to say about.
Yeah,
because its method is doubt.
Yeah. Like I don't think
And
scientific case to be made for the existence or non-existence of God.
Well, one of the questions that I've always had, and I don't know if this is relevant to the conversation, but I just have to ask it because you might have a better understanding. Because I followed John Vervaeke and watched many of his conversations. I actually watched a really great one yesterday. And I know that one of the motivating factors for his project is this what do you call it? This perhaps it's a disgust, maybe it's just an aversion to or a fear of bullshit. Okay. And I have to ask myself the question, how much do we get to know? Right? Like how much do we get to know? Like and one of the things that came to my mind as a Christian was that Genesis opens up with a bullshit story in the garden.
Yeah. Oh,
right.
Yeah.
Where the snake says to Eve,
not quite where it opens, but it comes
right.
I said it's not quite where it opens.
You're talking about Genesis 3. It's not the opening.
That's it opens for us.
Oh, I see.
For us as human beings,
we start
the beginning of the story with us is and this goes back to what I read from George McDonald, where he puts a egg in the sand.
But that is also the first.
He says some words on the over it. He says some words over the egg. It hatches into a serpent.
Yeah.
And then he says to Tangle, follow it.
Yeah, that was a very interesting image.
Right. So I just wonder. Also, I went through the book of Job with a friend, and one of the problematic symbols in the book of Job is the Leviathan. Okay. And so he's the chaos monster.
Yeah.
And God defends his existence, and Leviathan gets away. And there's a description at the end where Leviathan's swimming away and he leaves this wake of waves, and they're described as silver hair. Okay. Which is a symbol of wisdom. So the wake of Leviathan, right, is wisdom.
The encounter with chaos leads to wisdom.
Right. So how much of, I guess my question is, how much of bullshit do we really need to be afraid of, and how much, like, should we be protecting? Should we be protecting ourselves?
Let me just tell you where I'm coming from with that.
Yeah, I want to hear it.
I was telling you about how beautiful my dad's work was, but I have my relationship with my dad is complex. When I was 12 years old, my dad cheated on my mom with a young woman. And around that time, he used to say very often, like, you create your own reality. So we'd be saying, hey, Ray, don't come to our house and eat all our ice cream. It pisses us off. And be like, well, you create your own reality. And he was always using this kind of spiritual language to basically do this narcissistic spiritual bypassing.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, no, that's not okay. Right. You
Right.
can't do that. Right. You have to, like, so for me, growing up in a community where that kind of stuff was happening all the time, right? All these spiritual teachers. My mom was a follower of a guru, Amrit Desai, who founded Kripalu, which is a major yoga center, right? So she did all her yoga teacher training through Kripalu. So around that time, my parents were trying to work on their marriage, and Amrit Desai talked a lot about the value of monogamy and the importance of investing in that primary relationship. And it was a really like big part of his teaching. And it was something that my mom was really, really hungering for and
Right.
looking for this somebody who could really speak to what she needed in a marriage, somebody that maybe my dad would listen to. Well, it turned out that Amrit Desai had 20 plus women stored around the country in like halfway houses where they were being hidden by his disciples because he was having sexual affairs with them and he didn't want the world to know. Right. So I'm very, very concerned about how
Yeah, I think the guidance that the
I'm not
scriptures
saying
give
we
us for
shouldn't be
this.
concerned.
Well, no,
Yeah.
I mean the scriptures actually give us guidance in this. By their fruit shall you know them.
Yeah.
Right. So this is
But
so by their fruit shall you know them is a method of bullshit detection when it comes to like things that are like in the level of like human behavior and not necessarily facts of the world. Science is really good at detecting bullshit when it comes to things that are facts about the world, but the thing is, facts about the worlds aren't truth proper. There's something less than the truth. Let me share you. This is from another of McDonald's unspoken sermons. It's from I Am the Truth.
Yeah.
Where his reflection on Christ's statement, I am the truth, and what Christ means, what Christ means by that when he says I am the truth. He says this. He says the truth not as known to his intellect, but as revealed to his own sense of being true, known by his essential consciousness of his divine condition, without which his nature is neither his own nor God's. Trueness has made him free. Not any abstract truth, not truth, its very metaphysical self, can make any man free, but the truth done, the truth loved, the truth lived by the man, the truth of, and not merely in, the man himself. The honesty that makes the man himself a child of an honest God.
What occurs to me there is the sort of semantic difference between saying it is true that 2 + 2 = 4 versus saying my aim is true, or I am true to my wife.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
And that kind of truth, it's important. And so
there's a commonality though.
So
because we're saying in both cases, you're saying that there's something trustworthy. There's something trustworthy about 2 + 2 = 4. Although ultimately that 2 + 2 = 4 is actually it's trustworthy, but it's of less significance. Although you can certainly use that the 2 + 2 = 4 can be used to do and build a lot of things in the world. So it's very useful for manipulation of the world, but that other kind of like sense of like a person being true to their wife, that's a
different, right? 2 + 2
that's a more impactful ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, there are different species of truth in some sense. Like another one that I could give you is I could say that it is true that I had a latte as my first meal this morning. And that is either true or false, right? Like you guys can't actually confirm that from your position. I know whether it is true or false. But it's sort of like it's a particular, whereas 2 + 2 = 4 is a universal. And that particular it's true in a somewhat different way than the particular of whether I'm true to my wife or what it means to fully be true to my wife.
Right. So it comes down to like, so it comes down to this. It's like the kind of truth that people lean into
Mhm.
comes down to what they trust most.
Yeah.
Well,
So I didn't trust mysticism. That's for sure. For reasons.
Good,
And
for very good
I don't
reasons,
trust
it
it
sounds
easily.
yeah,
like.
and
Yeah.
that
But
I guess I
if I could
I
say
kind of
this,
want to clear. Oh, go
go
ahead.
ahead. Go ahead,
Go
Shari.
ahead.
Clarify.
I just kind of want to clarify where I'm coming from, because I first of all, I would love to, just crumple up the word mysticism and throw it in the trash can and invent a new one like John Vervaeke does, because it comes with so much baggage, like I said before. But I think that what I'm trying to get at is the idea of the coincidence of opposites, right? Of the tension that is held, and in that tension between the two opposing forces, something is made, something is forged, right? And so I'm not sure that making my ultimate goal in life to like, I don't think that oh man, I don't think that my goal should be to avoid bullshit, but my goal should be to glean wisdom from overcoming the bullshit, if that makes any sense, right?
I think it
And
does.
that
Maybe.
and
Can I
that
paraphrase
comes
that? Yeah.
that comes in that place of tension that you find yourself in,
Yeah.
right? When you're struggling between, and if we get caught up in truth, we're going to fall, we're going to end up in postmodernism. And that's why postmodernism, in my opinion, was born, because people started questioning what's true. And and the way I think about true is kind of like what Nate said, by their fruits you will know. But I think that this is also why Dostoevsky said beauty will save the world,
Mhm.
because beauty is the thing that leads us into truth and goodness, right?
Yeah.
And beauty is not something that you can't describe, like, what's the word I'm looking for?
Well,
You
there's
can't.
something. I just want to like okay. There's something.
Am I being too rambly?
No, 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 no,
Am I
no. It's
making
fine.
any
I just like
sense?
I want to affirm like Rafe's suspicion of bullshit because like there's you don't want to like
Absolutely.
bullshit.
Absolutely.
Here's the thing: is like bullshit is a power game. That's what's like bullshit is an attempt to use manipulation to force your ideas on another person, and it's an inherent like it is something that is it is untrue in both senses, right? Because the person who is bullshitting is both engaging in manipulation about the facts of the world, and they're also being an untrue person.
Yeah.
And trying to manipulate you.
Yeah, but what about bullshit that we don't know is bullshit, like Teflon? Okay. Like, come on.
I think that I think that that I, I I think maybe there's something you're pointing out, which I would definitely agree with, which is
Okay.
I think that what you're saying is that the project of radical certainty founded in doubt that
That's what
starts
I'm.
with Descartes won't scale up
Yeah.
towards a sustainable worldview.
Right.
And so if that's what we seek out, ultimately it's going to fail.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually agree with that. But I think that there's something in there where we have to sustain that rule out function and put it in proper relationship to the rule in function. And this is again that paradox of opposites that you're talking about, right? So if we look at the Eastern spiritual traditions like Zen and Tao, right, it's often it's couched. Spiritual insight is asked for by putting these opposites in tension to each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah, like that's McGilchrist uses the example of a violin, right?
Mhm.
You can't play any music on the strings until you've applied the tension to them.
Yeah.
Right. And so yeah, I don't know. And then the example of Leviathan from the book of Job is I said recently to a friend, these things take a lifetime to work out. And this is why we have one, right? So like for me personally, the gift that we're given is our life, right? And Rilke says, and the point is to live everything. He says it for that reason, right? Not to be afraid. And I know he wasn't, I know he was like your mom's guru there a little bit. He wasn't hiding all his mistresses though. But he said yes. Okay. It's an openness to that, right? And in Christianity, this is the example that Mary sets, where she says, "Let it be unto me," right? So she doesn't know what's coming, but she says yes to the thing, right? And it brings her pain and suffering, right? So she's pierced by it. But in the piercing, and I said this to a friend the other day, it's by our wounds that we are healed. Yeah. There's a scripture about that for Jesus. By his wounds we are healed. But for me, he is the shape of a human being. And it's by our wounds, right, that we are healed. And so it's this tension between these two things, healing and wounding, that forges us into the person who we are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Read Khalil Gibran?
Who?
Khalil Gibran.
I have.
Yeah. And so in his book, The Prophet, he says, in the passage on love, he says, when love beckons to you, go to him, though the sword hidden among his pinions may wound you.
Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah, and this is why the baby in the excerpt I read is standing in this molten, flaming, right? He's the old man of the fire. Yeah. And that fire for George MacDonald is God's love.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. In fact, the sermon directly after the one that we just read is the consuming fire. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
And that's why he says to her, he puts his cool hand on her heart and he says, now the fire will no longer burn you. Mm-hmm. Because when she came, part of the story that I didn't read, she has to jump into a river, a steaming hot river that's underground.
I want to tie something that you said, Shari, back to this idea of like bullshit and why we engage in bullshit. And it's like you mentioned the idea of your life being a gift, right?
Yes.
Like to me, this is like at the core of this idea, like of the childlikeness of God, theology of play. This like it connects directly to this idea of gift, because that people engage in bullshit because they think they have figured out what it's all about, and they want to make you play their game, do their dance, whatever it is that they're trying to get you to do. And
it goes back to exactly what Rafe was saying about this idea, epistemology of complete certainty. And I find in my interactions with human beings, people always want to go to the one thing. I know why all this is happening. It's for this reason. And it's never one thing, right? It's always like this ecology of many, many, many things that come together. And that's why I think God's speech in the book of Job is about nature, right? It's about this complex dynamical system that doesn't have a perceivable pattern, but underneath of it all, it does. This is why chaos theory is so interesting to me, right? Yeah. Because you have this beautiful pattern that's happening, but it's underneath and you can't see it. And so it appears to you like chaos, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what Leviathan is. He's this appearance of unperceivable pattern, but it's in retrospect, it's behind him in his wake that the silver hairs, right, give you some kind of clarity. And this is why I just keep going back to the idea that it takes us a lifetime, right? And it takes retrospect for us to be able to say, And the things that, the things that traumatized us, the things that were so hard for us to overcome at one point in our lives, suddenly become gifts to us, right?
Well, Billy Gabron says in his chapter on joy and sorrow, he says our sorrows carve the channels through which our joy moves.
Amen.
But I wanted to go back to bullshit. Why do we engage in bullshit? I don't think it's only because we seek certainty, or because we seek power.
No.
I actually think that I think some people are sociopathic narcissists, right? And they are just seeking power, or sadists who want to exert pain. But I think for most people, it's actually more like that point that Pageau made, which is about the elevation of a local good too high in the hierarchy. Right. To go back to the example of the young man who meets a beautiful woman, right? That the beauty and the attraction to love, those are not evil drives, right? They're actually the expressions of the same good that attracted him to his wife. It's the context that makes it wrong. It's a higher order good that makes that local good no longer good, right? But it's so easy to get trapped in that lower order good of beauty, of sexual attraction, all those things.
Of course, that it's easier to see that side of bullshit when you start thinking about it from the side of like our own self-deceptions, because usually we're not intentionally trying to manipulate ourselves.
No.
Right.
No, I think there's a combination of blindness and ego too, right? Like we just have blind spots that we can't see, right? And so this is why we discover who we are in the other, because they can show us those things that we can't see. And sometimes they're shocking and ugly. And then the ego jumps up and says, that's not who you are, right? And then we bullshit ourselves.
Yeah.
Because we don't have the humility to say to the other, you could be right. You could be right about me, it's hard to say that, right? And so I get an image of like a walled garden in a sense, where the ego is protecting itself from harm,
That's
and I think that God has mercy on that. Like every child does that, right? They protect themselves from harm.
Yeah.
And that's who we are. We are children in so
one of my kids dropped a bowl outside, right? And they came to me and said, this bowl fell outside and was broken, right? I was like, my older two are 11 and 9, and they're less likely to do that now. But my youngest one, who's 6, she's like, she put our remote control in a box of socks. And nobody could find the remote control, and we tracked it down and realized that she'd had it last. And we asked her, like, hey, do you know where this is? Like, did you leave it? And she said, no, it wasn't me. And then she's like, I'm gonna look in a very strange place, and she pulls it out immediately, right? and she's like, isn't it a mystery that it could have been there and that I could have found it, right? Like, no. But she is protecting, right? It's hard to see herself in where there's a potential criticism. That's painful for us. Right. But also we have a self-image that we project in our own mind. That is a low resolution version of the actual self, right? None of us has access to the full thing that we are. And we can be protective of that. And we actually have to be protective of it in some sense, because if we lose it, that's insanity, right? One of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently is this idea of how celebrity is probably the last thing anyone should want. Because what we do is we essentially propagate our avatar into a larger and larger network of people who we have an asymmetrical relationship with. So So we have huge social proof of an image that is less and less related to who we are actually internally experiencing ourselves as. So I think people actually get colonized by the image that other people have of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if you're a young person, and you get caught up in the Hollywood matrix, I think there's a reason why some of these people end up as addicts, because the inability to have a real sense of self and the incredible sort of buffeting of the spirit that is propagated across all these other minds. It's like every celebrity is in some sense in a constant battle with the demon of themselves that has been propagated in the public mind.
Well, really, all that does, I mean, that just is a magnification of something that I think happens with like with everyone.
Yeah, we all experience it. Right?
We all experience it. It's just that they're in a position where like all of that is like just magnified and makes it that much more challenging to overcome.
Yeah, we all need feedback mechanisms that allow ourselves and the people around us to update the image that we have, right? So this is like a classic problem that we have where people end up with a lot of tension in families, is that once you've left your family of origin, you've spent 90% of the time that you will ever spend with them. So you've left an impression, and as you change and mature, those changes are far less visible to your family
Yep.
than the previous changes were. So it's quite difficult for families to effectively update each other. And then you end up getting pulled into past dynamics. You end up feeling unseen by the people in your family because essentially they're just not getting the updates about you that they need.
Yeah. And, I know this well, and one of the things that I feel about that is that it's not their responsibility actually to update themselves on who I am. It's my responsibility to update them, but I can do it lovingly, right?
Yeah.
So when I wander into like a family get together and everybody sees me as the person they knew 10 years ago, now I have to update, right? I already know I'm standing in the room and I know that I'm 10 years younger as far as they're concerned, right? And now I need to update them in a way that is loving and humble. And it's on me to do that. They can't really, they can only update when I show them my updates. You know what I'm saying?
I think I would say that actually we all have a responsibility to be proactively trying to update with each other, because it's like, if I look at my children and I say, is it their responsibility to let me know that they've changed, or should I also take responsibility?
Yeah, totally.
Clearly, I also want to have that responsibility. But I think what you're pointing at is more this sense of people feel aggrieved by the inability of their family to update them, and they sort of feel like they take it personally, and that's really, really unhelpful. Right? You want to basically say, oh, this isn't my family just doesn't get me and they're cruel and they just don't care about who I really am problem. This is a universal human problem. And if I want to solve the problem, I have to recognize it and try to actively go out and create the feedback loops that allow me to come into coherence with
and you know how I figured it out, and it's really kind of silly, but I realized that my husband can't read my mind. Right? One day I'm like, oh wait, he probably can't read my mind. I have to tell him. And then I realized, oh, you know what? My family can't read my mind either.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's like the fact that the unfathomable mystery of that is a person is like, that's like one of the reasons that McDonald in that sermon, I Am the Truth, like that's why he points in that direction toward his understanding of truth. Yeah, because that's what the, like, when we talk about the truth in the deepest sense, like that's the thing that reflects it most to us.
And we're
Is
so
the depths of the mystery that is another, that is a person, and even ourselves, we're even a mystery to ourselves, as we're just discussing.
The human
So
that can be named is not the eternal human.
right.
Yeah.
The individual that can be named, the individual that can be defined, is not the full individual. Right.
Yeah.
We are always Raveke uses the language of the moreness and suchness, right?
Mhm.
And
There's something about you that always recedes from the capacity to grasp. The thing about that is that that's actually fundamental to love.
Yeah.
Right? If your human was solvable, you would fall out of love with them. When you think your human is solvable, then you fall out of love with them. They have to sort of recede from your grasp always in order for them to continue to be in a truly loving relationship.
Yeah, well, you talked about that in the beginning when you talked about the Peterson idea of having one foot in chaos and one foot in order.
Yeah.
And I remember when he talked about that and I heard it for the first time, I was like, and that he describes that as the seeking mode, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I always, like, before I listened to Peterson, I used to always tell people, Jesus said, if you seek, you will find.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't say, and then you can stop seeking.
Yeah.
Right. So that is what he's talking about. He's talking about the 1 foot in order and the 1 foot in chaos, right? The seeking and the finding.
Yeah.
And being in that mode of seeking is where you have your optimal meaning in your life, right? That's that yin and yang, that's that center line, right? Is the place of optimal meaning in your life. And that's why when kids are playing outside building a fort or whatever, and the fort's done, they all go home and have lunch because they finished the thing. There's no more chaos, right? There's too much order. Okay, now we got to go bust it down and redesign it,
Yeah, we need a new frame.
Yeah.
That's what I love about parkour is it's a kind of consistent confrontation with chaotic potential, right?
Right. It's beautiful.
Go out and you find a new jump, a new sequence, a new route, and then you battle with your ability to come to grips with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then
I can't remember who the theologian was that I was listening to recently who was talking about, like, the way in which God knows God's self is not incompatible with God also remaining a mystery to God's self. So
well, a very famous Rhineland mystic, Meister Eckhart, who I just love because he's full of riddles and inversions and coincidence of opposites. He said, the eye with which you see God is the eye with which God sees you. Right? And this is this beautiful idea of the shape of the human being. I have an icon corner, and when I say my prayers, sometimes I'm looking at my icon of Christ, and sometimes I close my eyes, and the first time it happened to me, I was just like struck by it because I saw the shape of a human being, and I'm like, that's God. Right? Like, that leftover light in your behind your eyelids. And I just saw this shape, and I'm like, that's God's shape. It's the shape of a human being. And that's why that portion of the sermon that Nate brought up, where, what was it, Nate? How did he say that? Something
he said that he became flesh, but he did not become a man, for he was already man.
Yeah. That really spoke to me for those reasons, And it took me as a Christian so long to figure that out, because the Sky Daddy thing, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, that's God. I got to see him as God, he's God. And then one day I closed my eyes in prayer and I saw the shape of a human being, and it was all like crystal. I was like, oh, God is a human being.
we've taken up a lot of your time. I just wanted to say this. I just wanted to say this to you. I think like I don't really care what anybody's like beliefs are.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I that's beyond my concern. I will say this. I will say that like in your work and in your person, and that you reflect to me the kind of God I believe in.
Yeah. Amen.
So yeah,
Very, very kind.
yeah.
I thank you.
Yeah.
I'm trying, right?
No.
I'm trying to struggle upward towards that city on a hill, and even if I don't, I hold a space for this scientific epistemological worldview, and for the narrative symbolic, how they unite. I'm not sure, but from a scientific perspective, I don't think the question of Christ's incarnation is answerable, or his resurrection. From a narrative perspective, I think that it guides me to the type of human being that I'd like to be better than anything else that I've seen.
Yeah.
There's a really great lesson in this story of Phantastes that George MacDonald wrote, where the main character, whose name is Anodos, which means homeless, or having no home, or having not found a way, or something like that.
Without a path, I think.
Without a path, that's what it is.
Yeah.
He's entering into fairyland, and as he's entering into fairyland, he starts seeing in his peripheral, he starts seeing shapes of human beings, right, running around, and then he looks, and when he looks at them, he only sees a bush or a rock or a tree, and what George is saying there is that we see things for what they are, what they truly are, in our periphery, but when we focus straight on them, and then this gets right to the whole targeting thing that Peterson talks about, right? Hyper focusing. When we focus straight on them, they lose their actual shape, right? And for George, the cosmos is incarnational, right? It is an incarnation of God. And he has a little poem at the beginning of that chapter in Phantastes, and it's written by a friend of his, actually, who was a young poet at the time. And it says, "Man doth usurp all space, stares thee in rock, bush, river in the face. Never thine eyes behold a tree. 'Tis no sea thou seest in the sea. 'Tis but a disguised humanity. To avoid thy fellow, vain thy plan. All that interests a man is man." And that, to me, is I find that the most beautiful way to describe what incarnational actually is, right? He uses the example of the snowdrop, as he says, science can tear it apart, but they'll never see that it is hope and pale confident submission, because the snowdrop comes out of the snow in the spring, and it's pale green, and its head droops, right? But it's looking forward to the summer, right? It's looking forward to when all this is gone. And so these are the what I call poetic relations, but you could just simply think of it as incarnational, right? So you see the snowdrop, and it's a man, right? As Henry Sutton says in his poem, all that man sees is a man. You see a man with his head bowed in hope and pale confident submission, and that's the story we're in, right? And I'm sure you see that. I'm sure you've seen those things on your runs through the woods,
Yeah.
shapes.
in the scientific world, we call that anthropomorphizing. But I think there's a reciprocal, right? I'd have to go deeper along some of these ideas, but man is also nature reflected, right? And
Yes, George MacDonald says that the world is the man turned inside out. That's what he says. And he says basically he shows how language derives itself from creation. Okay. And I did a whole series on this channel with on the imagination essay by George MacDonald, which is just amazing. Just amazing.
I'll have to check it out.
Well, and I mean,
well, you don't have to watch my series, but if you read the essay, it's not
George
that
MacDonald.
long.
I'm curious about George MacDonald because I have this fundamental curiosity about if we take this as given that there's this sort of frame of Nietzsche and the death of God and how we're still fighting it, it seems like the Inklings had a very sophisticated solution, and somehow it got lost. Right? I was talking to Joshua Luke Smith. I don't know if you guys follow Joshua Luke Smith.
Was he the poet at the ARC conference?
Yeah,
Oh, it was beautiful.
It was incredible. I was talking to him about this idea that like the Christianity that I grew up with, that was sort of predominant in the American culture during my childhood of the 90s, it didn't produce great art. It produced extremely bad art. Right?
Impoverished is the
word. Art, right? There's the great, or the most successful Christian art of my childhood was the Left Behind series.
Oh gosh.
It's something far short of Tolkien, right? But I wonder where that is and why it's been lost and what it means that it's been lost, right?
Well, I think it gets back to the point is to live everything by Rilke, right? Like God, this is how I see it. God breathed his spirit into us. That breath was life. Yeah. Right? Life with a capital L, the journey. And we stopped living. Christians, I'm saying, like this Left Behind series is, to me, it's like a gray mummified corpse.
Right? Well, and it also lost all sense of, like, that is a Christianity that's lost all sense of the childlikeness of God, because it's all like grimly serious, like totally focused on, like, it's like hyper specific moral vision and the end of the world, and it doesn't take time to have real joy in anything,
and it lost its peripheral vision, right? Like it no longer sees humanity.
But one of the interesting things to me about Tolkien and Lewis is that both of them place their Christian parables, I don't know if Tolkien would accept that, but I think it's close enough to the truth, within a pagan world, right? Yeah. It's a fawn that greets you on the way into Aslan's kingdom. It's talking animals. For me, there's something that speaks to somehow something that was lost within Christianity that was present within the pagan worldview that has to be reintegrated. And I think the body is part of that. Play is part of that. True connection to the natural world. It's it's really interesting because when I was young, again, that evangelical Christianity that was dominant in the 90s, it was a Christianity that saw the world as properly subservient to man, and that whatever we wanted to extract was fine, right? Like it's all here for us. It doesn't matter what we do with it.
Yeah. That's actually almost the question I almost began the conversation with, was asking, what is it all for?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you think that your father in heaven is a sky daddy who's got like thunderbolts, right, and he's just tyrannizing you, then that's the child.
Or
You will
that he's given you part of his power and that you share in his power and dominion. Like, either way, that's
yeah.
not like God doesn't need anything. So whatever, the answer to the question, like, what is it all for, is not something that there can be a definitive answer, because God doesn't need anything. It's just it is pure creative gift. That's what it's for.
My father was raised in the Catholic Church, but left it to become a New Age person. But he always retained a great love for Christ and for some of the saints, particularly Saint Francis of Assisi. And he said he believed that our purpose on earth is to become gardeners of Eden.
I was just going to say, I listened to a beautiful talk by a rabbi where he shows there's two stories of the creation of the human being, or two commands given by God. One is tend a garden, and the other one is have dominion over it. Right? Those things come into conflict with each other if you do one at the exclusion of the other. But you have to do them in service to one another.
There is
right?
no work or toil before the eating of the fruit.
Leader as you know, well, it's kind of like marriage. Right?
Yeah.
If you view leadership as the exercise of power, you're not going to create a healthy marriage.
Right.
But if you view leadership as a necessity for sacrifice, it creates a very different dynamic.
Yeah.
And that's fundamentally what I believe, that we are called to love the world better.
Yeah.
Right. That is the ultimate. Yeah. That is the ultimate. For me, that's the ultimate message of the Christian worldview, is that we are here to the way that I say is the purpose of the practices that we engage in ultimately is to cultivate virtue, so that we can seek truth to serve love while respecting the mystery of being.
Amen. Yeah.
No argument for me.
Perfect. Yeah.
That's I gotta go.
Yeah. I've tried to wrap you. Yeah, thank you for your time. Appreciate you joining us today. It was good talk. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you guys. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you.